Minister, you couldn't but obviously welcome the bill, but it's mainly a technical bill. And I have to say that I've been working with the likes of the Phoenix Project since I was Minister of Social Protection. And the idea that this problem has gone away or that there's not a huge crisis out there, I think is incorrect. I think what has happened is it has gone out of the news and that there's silent suffering there and that we need to come up with solutions that work. Now, one thing I saw government and it's happening is people putting in schemes, but the schemes are so surrounded by rules that in fact it's nearly impossible to benefit from these schemes. And one of these schemes is the mortgage to rent scheme. Now there have been 50 mortgage to rent arrangements concluded. So in reality, it's not making any impression on the massive number of people who are in long-term arrears. For example, on the 3rd of December, there was 84,955 people in arrears of over 90 days. And this doesn't take into account that even people with the mortgage is up to date, a lot of them have personal debts in unsecured lending. And there were 117,000 people in mortgage arrears. Now, the reality is that a solution of 50 out of that number is no solution. It's good for the 50, but it's not, in the greater scheme of things, making any impression on the problem. Now, I was always very, very doubtful about this personal insolvency regime you brought in for a whole lot of reasons. The cost of going for personal insolvency and the fact that the bank has the veto. And in many cases, the banks were as culpable as the borrowers in what happened. But again, just look at the numbers. Your predecessor, Minister Shatter, when he was Minister Shatter, said there'd be 21,000, and that would be a significant number of solutions. It would be a very significant number of solutions in the first year. But what are we getting instead? We got 1,000, and of those, 547, and that is all, were personal insolvency without bankruptcy, and 448 were bankruptcy, which actually meant that they could have gone straight for bankruptcy in the first place. So you actually only had this personal insolvency legislation resolving the issue through personal insolvency for 547 cases. An interesting statement that's often made is that a large number of people who are in debt have jobs, but a large number also have been temporarily unemployed. And I can never understand, as somebody who was in the Department of Social Protection, what came over the government when they abolished the mortgage interest supplement. And the amazing thing is when we look and talk about the Troika agreement, the 4-year plan, and the Troika agreement, the mortgage interest supplement was in fact meant to be one of the main instruments to assist people who ran into mortgage debt because of unemployment. And one of the statistics that used to fascinate me as minister was that many people lose employment and then get re-employed again after a period. But if you create a debt during that period, so the idea of tiding people over during periods of unemployment that might last for a year or two makes a lot of sense. Because once they get re-employed, unless you have mounted up a big debt on them, they can then do or live without the mortgage interest supplement. But instead of that, this safety net, just when it was needed most, was abolished. And of course, it doesn't save any money, because the reality is If people can't pay their mortgages, they wind up claiming rent supplement in a property if they can get a property. Now, when we look at the mortgage to rent scheme, 50 people, you have to say, well, what's the problem? My colleague, Deputy Dooley, identified a number of problems. The value or the income limits, the value of the houses. But another perennial problem I come across is that somebody might be in a 3-bedroom house. And there might be a mortgage difficulty. They might have remortgaged the house or something to consolidate debts at some stage. I know that they hit hard times. And when they go for the mortgage to rent, they're told that their own home, and I'm talking about 3- or 4-bedroom homes, I'm not talking about trophy homes. They're told that their own home is too big for their requirement. Now, have we got a heart? Have we not got a heart? What is the point in putting people out of their own homes and then having to, at even more expense, relocate them and get them or pay for their accommodation through rent supplement or through providing them with social housing? So the mortgage to rent scheme needs a total revamp. The second thing I think has to be faced up to is that the banks cannot continue to have a veto. Now, when we're talking about the so-called covered institutions, they wouldn't be there if the Irish people hadn't ensured their survival, not for the good of the people who owned them, but because there were lots of implications if your banking system collapsed, including the implications for the depositors in our banks. But the fact of the matter is that the banks take a ruthless view, and in my view are not particularly increasing their own income. So what you hear of is somebody makes an offer to the bank that would sustain the mortgage relatively well, and the bank don't accept it. And they put it on the market, and they accept much less money than if they had written down part of the mortgage. Now, my understanding too is that some banks, when they split the mortgage, they don't charge any interest on the part that is split. And other banks do. Some banks defer the capital and are going to come back after you again. And of course, that just means you're pushing off the evil day. As I said, there are cases that if you wrote off 20 or 30% of the loan, it would still be cheaper than selling the house at 50% discount on the open market. And I hear about moral hazard. Well, how bankers lecturing us about moral hazard, I think is a little bit ironic. And the reality is that most people got into trouble for a variety of reasons, including loss of income, maybe paying too much for a house because they had a family. Now, as I said earlier, Minister, I've had continuous contact, particularly with the Phoenix Project, over the last 4 or 5 years. These work are a voluntary body based in Portlaoise. I understand they have met the Minister of Finance. They're looking to meet the Taoiseach. What they tell me from the coalface all of the time is frightening. And they're very, very concerned, and justifiably so, that there's a hidden crisis coming down the road. Now, when we look at the solutions claimed by the banks claim 109,000 solutions. But when you actually look at them, loss of ownership solutions are 49,000 of those. And these are on family homes I'm talking about. I'm not talking about buy-to-rents or buy-to-lets. So will somebody tell me, where are these 49,000 people to go? We've already established that there is no mortgage to rent scheme we're talking about. These people cannot afford to buy houses. And where are they going to get houses to rent? And who's going to pay the rent? I think inevitably it'll be the state pick it up. So you're going to play musical chairs with 49,000 families, which works out, when you think of the numbers in a household, at an average of 122,000 people. Now, is this humane? Is it fair? Are there other solutions? Now, what people are doing is, faced with literally a blank alley, with no choice. I mean, this idea, you know, when somebody makes you walk with a gun to your head, you can't say that I freely chose to do whatever the person with the gun to your head is. In other words, the banks are saying we'll either throw you out or walk out. Now, the advantage of walking out voluntarily is that you might get a higher price for the house and therefore reduce the residual debt. Or the bank might agree to write off the residual debt, because the bank would much prefer, of course, for you to voluntarily sell the house. But the reality is we're making these people lose their homes. I think it's of concern that the number of repossessions is rising. For Q4 2013, legal proceedings in repossessions was 1,491. For Q3 2014, it had gone up 168% to 2,514. The number taken into possession in Q4 2013 was 68. Q3 2014, 302. So not only are voluntary repossessions going through the ceiling, but the banks are beginning to move in and repossess. Now, you know the reason for this, Minister, so do I. And that is that what the banks are doing is selling the loan books. So a fund comes in that has no high street presence, has no need to protect its reputation, and it buys the loan book. And the way they are treating, and we warned about this, the way they are treating debtors now, the way they're treating people who owe them money, who borrowed money, is very different than the way a high street bank can do. Civil bills for repossession issued countrywide January to December 2014 was 7,266. That is 21,000 people if you take an average of 3 per house. And what I'm saying, Minister, is we have a major, major problem. We can talk about how it came about forever. But my view is what we need now is to recognize the time bomb we're sitting on and to do something about it. And we need radical change. The idea that this problem is under control is not true. It's not true for any of the households that I have spoken about. What we need to do, particularly with the introduction of the so-called vulture funds into the equation, we need to change the whole process and bring forward compulsory resolution where that makes sense. And that means that we need actually to take away the bank's veto. We also need to make sure that anybody who has to leave their house through a repossession order has somewhere to go. If somebody parks on public property illegally, rightly so, if they've been moved on, the local authority has to provide somewhere for them to go. But in the case of repossession, that doesn't have to be proven, even where the person has made significant effort to look for alternative accommodation. I think, Minister, to put it simply, what we need to do is, number one, say on split mortgages that there will be no interest charge on the split part of the mortgage. In other words, when you warehouse part of a mortgage, there should be no interest. The second thing is term extensions, particularly for older people, should be up to life. Because when you get people, their 50s or their 60s, they're told they cannot get a term extension that makes any significance. As I said, mortgage to rent needs to be radically revamped. And until we see that scheme giving significant numbers, we cannot consider it as even being part of the package because it's just so derisory. In the case that debt write-down, and let's just take moral hazard out of this, because to put it simply, as I said one day, somebody was on about moral hazard. If you wanted to take that argument to its logical conclusion, you decide that somebody who smoked or somebody who indulged in all sorts of things wouldn't be taken into a hospital. It's irrational, it's absolutely mad kind of thinking. And I don't think anybody in a civilized society can buy into this so-called moral hazard rule. If it's cheaper for the bank to write down debt than to sell the property on the open market, I believe it should be compulsory for them to accept that particular solution. Because as I said, you take a debt of 200,000, you write off, say, 60,000, 140,000, and the property on the open market would sell for 100. Isn't it ridiculous that the person in situ can't settle for the 140,000, but the bank has no problem selling it for 40 and losing, or selling it for 100 and losing another 40,000? Thank you, Minister, and I hope you'll give serious consideration to the points I made.